The hidden mental powers of the 1960s-1970s generation. There's something remarkable happening in psychology research that nobody's talking about. Scientists have discovered that people who grew up in the 1960s and 1970s possess 9 specific mental strengths that are vanishing from modern society. These aren't just nostalgic memories or romanticized tales of the good old days. According to findings reported by French newspaper Ouest France and echoed across international psychological communities, these mental capabilities were forged in an entirely different world, a world without smartphones, without instant answers, without the digital safety nets that define life today. And here's what makes this unsettling. These strengths may hold the key to understanding why anxiety, depression, and stress have skyrocketed in younger generations. What were these 9 mental powers? How did a generation develop psychological resilience that researchers say is increasingly rare? And most importantly, can these abilities be reclaimed in our hyper-connected age? Stay with us, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why the way we lived 5 decades ago might be the blueprint for mental health that modern society desperately needs. The first mental strength that defined those who grew up in the 60s and 70s was something that seems almost archaic today: patience. But this wasn't just the ability to wait, it was a fundamental rewiring of how the brain processes time and reward. In the 1960s and 1970s, information moved at a glacial pace by today's standards. Want to know something? You waited for the encyclopedia to arrive at the library. Expecting an important letter? You checked the mailbox daily, sometimes for weeks. Waiting to hear your favorite song? You sat by the radio for hours, hoping the DJ would play it. This constant exposure to waiting did something profound to the developing brain. Psychologists today recognize this as the cultivation of delayed gratification, a skill so powerful that Stanford University's famous marshmallow experiments in the late 1960s revealed it could predict future success better than IQ scores. Children who learned to wait for rewards developed stronger prefrontal cortex activity, the brain region responsible for planning and impulse control. But here's where it gets fascinating. Research published in follow-up studies spanning 40 years showed that individuals who mastered delayed gratification as children maintained better decision-making abilities, lower stress levels, and greater peace of mind throughout their entire lives. The generation raised in the 60s and 70s didn't just learn patience, they had it hardwired into their psychological operating system. Today, we live in a world where waiting 15 seconds for a video to load feels like an eternity. We've traded the mental strength of patience for the instant dopamine hit of immediate gratification. And psychologists warn that this trade-off comes at a devastating cost. Section 2. Emotional regulation in a logical world. The second mental strength was something that modern psychology struggles to teach: the ability to regulate emotions through logic rather than expression. Growing up in the 60s and 70s meant navigating a world where emotional displays were often discouraged, where logic and reason were valued over feelings. This wasn't about suppression, it was about developing a different relationship with emotions. Children learn to process their feelings internally, to analyze them, to understand them before acting on them. Recent psychological studies reveal something remarkable about this approach. Research shows that individuals who developed strong self-control during childhood demonstrate significantly lower levels of anxiety and stress in adolescence and adulthood. They learned what modern neuroscience now confirms, that the gap between feeling an emotion and acting on it is where real emotional intelligence lives. Consider this. In the pre-digital era, if you felt angry at a friend, you couldn't fire off an impulsive text or post a passive-aggressive status update. You had to sit with that anger. You had to think about it, process it, decide how to address it face-to-face. This forced delay created a natural cooling-off period that modern communication has completely eliminated.
But there's a critical nuance here that researchers emphasize. This wasn't about bottling up emotions. It was about developing the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate the limbic system's emotional responses. The generation that grew up without instant emotional outlets accidentally developed one of the most valuable mental health tools, the ability to feel deeply while thinking clearly.
Section 3. The contentment that modern life forgot. The third mental strength is perhaps the most countercultural in our consumer-driven age: satisfaction with what you have. People who grew up in the 1960s and 1970s experienced something that's nearly extinct today. They lived with less and felt more. Psychologists call this non-attachment, or life satisfaction, and it's one of the strongest predictors of long-term happiness. Think about childhood in that era. Most families had one television, one phone, one car. Toys came at birthdays and Christmas, not as weekly Amazon deliveries. New clothes were events, not impulse purchases. This scarcity wasn't poverty, it was the normal rhythm of life. And something unexpected happened in those young brains. Without constant exposure to more and better and newer, children developed neural pathways associated with contentment rather than comparison. They learned to extract maximum joy from what they possessed because they knew it might be months before something new arrived. Modern psychology has documented what happens when this mental strength is absent. Research shows that today's culture of constant upgrading and comparison shopping is directly correlated with increased rates of depression, anxiety, and a phenomenon called hedonic adaptation, where each new acquisition brings less happiness than the last. But here's the revelation researchers find most compelling. Contentment isn't just about having less, it's about expecting less change. The generation that grew up in the 60s and 70s developed a baseline satisfaction that acted as a buffer against the emptiness of endless striving. This wasn't resignation, it was a profound understanding that happiness doesn't come from acquisition, it comes from appreciation. Section 4. The power of internal locus of control. The fourth mental strength revolutionizes how we understand personal power: belief in one's own ability. In psychological terms, this is called an internal locus of control, the belief that your actions directly influence your outcomes. And for those who grew up in the 60s and 70s, this wasn't a concept to be taught, it was a reality to be lived daily. Your bike chain broke? You fixed it or you walked. Got lost? You figured out the way home. Forgot your homework? You faced the consequences. There was no helicopter parent to swoop in, no smartphone to call for rescue, no GPS to guide you step by step. What seemed like simple necessity was actually intensive psychological training. Every problem solved independently deposited evidence into the mental bank account that said, "I am capable, I can figure things out, my effort matters." Contemporary research reveals the profound impact of this mental strength. Studies show that individuals with a strong internal locus of control experience less depression, higher academic achievement, better physical health, and greater career success. They see challenges as solvable puzzles rather than insurmountable obstacles. But here's the concerning trend researchers have identified. Modern parenting and education increasingly foster external locus of control. When children grow up with constant intervention, when they learn that every problem has a quick digital solution, they internalize a different message: "I need help. Someone else has the answer. I'm not capable alone." The generation that grew up in the 60s and 70s had no choice but to trust their own effort and discipline. That trust became the foundation of resilient mental health. Section 5. Tolerance to discomfort. The fifth mental strength might be the most uncomfortable to discuss: tolerance to discomfort itself. Growing up in the pre-digital age meant constant exposure to situations that were boring, awkward, frustrating, or just plain unpleasant. You waited in long lines, you sat through uncomfortable silences, you endured tedious tasks without escape hatches, you experienced physical discomfort without immediate relief. And psychologists now understand that this regular exposure to discomfort was like weight training for the emotional nervous system. It developed what researchers called distress tolerance, the capacity to experience unpleasant emotions or situations without falling apart or seeking immediate relief. Consider the marshmallow experiment again, conducted during this exact era. Children who could sit with the discomfort of wanting something but not having it developed neural pathways associated with emotional regulation and resilience. They literally built brain architecture that could withstand psychological pressure. Modern research reveals a troubling pattern. Decreased exposure to discomfort correlates directly with increased anxiety disorders. When every uncomfortable feeling triggers an immediate coping mechanism, checking phones, watching videos, seeking distraction, the brain never learns that discomfort is survivable. But the generation raised in the 60s and 70s had a different relationship with discomfort. They discovered through repeated experience that you could sit in the waiting room for an hour and be okay. You could be bored on a long car ride and survive. You could have an awkward conversation and come out the other side. This emotional flexibility, the ability to experience negative states without catastrophizing, became psychological armor that protected them throughout their lives. Section 6. Practical problem solving. The sixth mental strength transformed everyday challenges into confidence-building exercises, solving problems with practicality. In the decades before YouTube tutorials and Reddit threads, if something broke, you had two choices: figure out how to fix it or live without it. This wasn't about becoming a master mechanic or electrician. It was about developing a problem-solving mentality that said, "I'll figure this out." Reading paper maps without GPS, fixing a broken toy with whatever tools were in the garage, figuring out how to program a VCR without a manual. These weren't remarkable achievements, they were Tuesday afternoons. But each small victory deposited something valuable into the psychological account: proof of competence. Research in self-efficacy theory shows that mastery experiences, successfully completing challenging tasks, are the most powerful source of confidence. And those who grew up in the 60s and 70s accumulated thousands of these experiences. Contemporary studies reveal something concerning about modern dependence on instant solutions. When people immediately Google every problem or ask AI for answers, they miss the neurological benefits of struggle and discovery. The brain's reward system activates most powerfully when we overcome challenges independently. The generation that grew up with practical problem solving didn't just learn skills, they developed a fundamental trust in their ability to adapt and overcome. This confidence, based on proven competence, became a cornerstone of resilient mental health. Section 7. Waiting for rewards. The seventh mental strength takes us back to a fundamental principle that shaped an entire generation: waiting for rewards. Everything in the 60s and 70s required waiting. Saving money for months to buy something meaningful. Waiting for your favorite TV show to air. No streaming, no on-demand, just patience. Waiting for birthday parties, holidays, special occasions. The anticipation itself became part of the reward. A comprehensive 2020 meta-analysis examining decades of research on self-regulation revealed something remarkable.
The ability to delay gratification in childhood predicts better academic performance, superior mental health, and healthier behaviors in adulthood, with stunning accuracy. But here's what makes this mental strength so powerful. It wasn't just about waiting, it was about what waiting taught. Children learned that good things take time, that effort compounds, that anticipation enhances enjoyment, that instant gratification often leads to lesser satisfaction than patient reward. Neuroscientists have discovered that delayed gratification activates the prefrontal cortex while suppressing the limbic system's demand for immediate pleasure. This pattern, repeated thousands of times during childhood, literally rewired how the brain processes desire and satisfaction. Today's world has systematically eliminated waiting from nearly every experience. Want something? Order it with overnight shipping. Hungry? Food delivery in 30 minutes. Bored? Infinite entertainment at your fingertips. We've removed the very mechanism that builds self-control, reduces impulsivity, and increases long-term satisfaction. The generation raised in the 60s and 70s didn't choose delayed gratification. It was woven into the fabric of daily life. And that involuntary training created a mental strength that psychologists recognize as increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. Section 8. Concentrated attention. The eighth mental strength addresses what many consider the crisis of our current age, the ability to concentrate deeply. For those who grew up in the 60s and 70s, sustained attention wasn't optional, it was how you engaged with the world. Reading books for hours without distraction, writing letters that required careful thought and composition, listening to entire albums from beginning to end, having conversations without phones interrupting every few minutes. Research in cognitive psychology reveals that these activities developed what neuroscientists call sustained attention networks, brain circuits specialized in maintaining focus on a single task for extended periods. These networks strengthen with use, like muscles under training. But here's the critical finding. These same networks atrophy without use. Modern studies using brain imaging show that constant task switching and digital multitasking actually shrink the gray matter in regions associated with cognitive control and attention. The generation that grew up reading encyclopedias, building model airplanes, and playing board games developed attention spans measured in hours, not seconds. They could immerse themselves in complex tasks, think deeply about challenging problems, and sustain concentration despite discomfort or boredom. Today's world operates on what psychologists call the attention economy, where every app, website, and platform competes for microseconds of focus. We've removed the very mechanism that builds self-control, reduces impulsivity, and increases long-term satisfaction. The generation that was raised in the 60s and 70s didn't choose delayed gratification, it was woven into the fabric of daily life. And that involuntary training created a mental strength that psychologists recognize as increasingly rare and increasingly valuable.
Section 9. Face-to-face conflict resolution. The ninth and perhaps most socially crucial mental strength, direct conflict management. In the pre-digital world, if you had a problem with someone, there was only one path forward, talking to them face-to-face. No hiding behind text messages, no ghosting, no passive-aggressive social media posts, just two people, one conversation, working through discomfort toward resolution. This forced intimacy with conflict developed multiple interconnected mental strengths. First, the ability to read body language and facial expressions, nonverbal communication that carries over 70% of emotional information in any interaction. Second, active listening skills that required presence and attention. Third, emotional regulation under pressure as you navigated difficult conversations in real time. Psychological research on communication shows something fascinating about this generation's approach to conflict. By having no digital escape routes, they developed what therapists call conflict tolerance, the ability to stay in difficult conversations rather than avoiding them or escalating them. But there's an even deeper skill at work here. Face-to-face conflict resolution requires interpreting complex emotional signals, modulating your own emotional responses, finding the right words in the moment, and reading how your message lands. It's an intensive workout for emotional intelligence that digital communication completely bypasses. Modern studies reveal the cost of losing this mental strength. Research shows increased social anxiety, difficulty with intimate relationships, polarization in communication styles, and a phenomenon called asynchronous conflict escalation, where disagreements worsen because participants aren't reading each other's humanity in real time. The generation that grew up in the 60s and 70s became experts in a form of communication that's nearly extinct. Honest, uncomfortable, but ultimately connecting dialogue that required courage, vulnerability, and presence. Conclusion: the hidden message. So here's what we've uncovered about those who grew up in the 1960s and 1970s. 9 mental strengths that weren't taught, they were lived. Patience that rewired the brain for better decision-making. Emotional regulation that balanced feeling with thinking. Contentment that protected against the emptiness of endless wanting, belief in personal capability that fostered resilience, tolerance to discomfort that built emotional armor, practical problem solving that generated confidence through competence, the ability to wait for rewards that enhanced long-term satisfaction, concentrated attention that enabled deep thinking and meaningful work, and direct conflict management that developed authentic human connection. But here's what makes this research so powerful and so urgent. These aren't just nostalgic observations about the good old days. They're scientifically documented psychological strengths that correlate directly with mental health, life satisfaction, and resilience. The French newspaper West France reported these findings not as a criticism of modern life, but as a wake-up call. Psychologists across international communities are asking a crucial question. What happens to a society when an entire generation grows up without developing these fundamental mental strengths? The answer is already visible in the data. Unprecedented rates of anxiety and depression, attention disorders at epidemic levels, declining ability to delay gratification, difficulty managing conflict and maintaining relationships, decreased resilience in face of adversity. But there's hope in understanding. These mental strengths weren't genetic gifts, they were environmental adaptations. They were created by circumstances that forced patience, demanded resourcefulness, required direct communication, and offered no digital escape hatches, which means they can be recreated, not by abandoning technology or romanticizing the past, but by consciously choosing to expose ourselves and our children to the very conditions that build these strengths. Practice waiting, sit with discomfort, solve problems without immediately Googling solutions, have difficult conversations face-to-face, build sustained attention through deliberate practice. The generation that grew up in the 60s and 70s didn't know they were developing rare mental powers. They were simply living in a world that required them. Now that we understand what was gained in that analog age, we face a choice. Will we reclaim these strengths or watch them disappear completely? If you grew up in the 1960s or 1970s, we want to hear from you. Which of these 9 mental strengths do you recognize in yourself? What other differences have you noticed between your generation and today's world? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters. And if you found this research as fascinating as we did, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We're diving deep into the psychology, neuroscience, and hidden history that shapes who we are. There are more stories like this waiting to be told, and we're just getting started. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.